Hello, this is Hatfield House in Hertfordshire. It's about 20 miles north of London, and it's the home of Lord Salisbury. And it was built, obviously, by Lord Salisbury. Not the same one, built about 420 years ago. But, they're still there. So this is built in 1608, started in 1608, took about 4 years to build. And the Lord Salisbury at the time, Robert Cecil, he was sort of like the Prime Minister. He was the Lord Treasurer, the principal secretary to King James I then, and he'd actually brought James I to England from Scotland to become king. And this had sort of been planned, really, by Queen Elizabeth I, his original mistress, but it had been made a reality by Cecil, who was rather good at organising things. Here he is on the right nearest us in a famous painting of the Somerset House Conference in 1604, which was negotiating a peace treaty to bring to an end the long war between Spain and England. The Spanish and Flemish delegates are on the left, and all the English ones on the right. And here's our hero's face. And his face was quite nice, wasn't it? And this is a face pattern, really. So he had his face painted by somebody called John de Critz, who then made multiple copies of the face pattern and would send them off to other painters to include him in bigger portraits, other portraits, wearing different outfits. Here he is. Same face, different outfit. And here again, this is pretty much exactly the same. That's at Knowle. Anyway, the point is that he was a tiny little man. He was referred to by Queen Elizabeth as her little man, her pygmy, my pygmy. Not terribly flattering, really. And he was not only quite short, but he also had terrible scoliosis. He had a bit of a hunchback. And as a result, Queen Elizabeth called him my pygmy. King James I called him my little beagle, and my little man. And he was much laughed at by people for being called these nicknames and for not looking terribly sort of presentable. But he used it to his advantage, and he pretty much had control of everything and was very good at doing that. Now, this is the house that his father had built. This was called Theobalds, and it's spelt Theobalds, but pronounced Theobalds. And this was about 10 miles to the east of where Hatfield is. This was an enormous house, as you can see. This is a sort of conjectural reconstruction of it by some scholar, based on surviving drawings for it, quite a lot of them done by Robert's father, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, who was the first minister of Elizabeth I for almost all of her reign, and he managed to die about 5 years before she did and handed over to his younger son, Robert. But Theobald, as you can see, was a vast, enormous house. And when James I came to England, organised by Robert Cecil, he stopped at this house on his way to London. He was entertained by Cecil there, and then made his way on to London. And then he loved this house, and the house had been used by William Cecil, the father, to entertain Elizabeth I many times. She'd stayed there 8 different times, I think, over the years, and always brought the entire court with her, and so it was basically like a palace. And it was very convenient because it was on the main road north. And so James I stayed here at the beginning of his reign, and then he liked it very much. And so he arrived in 1603. In 1607, he said to Robert Cecil, you know what, maybe we should just swap houses. I'll take this one, which I rather like, and you can have something else. What do you want? And so Robert Cecil said, well, I'll have Hatfield, sir. That'd be marvellous. And he had Anyway, William Cecil, the father, having built the enormous Theobalds, quite often said to people, my son will never be able to keep it up. He won't have the money to keep this place going. And so they'd sort of been thinking that they'd have to sell it. And instead of selling it, he managed to swap it for various other properties. And so he swapped it for Hatfield. Now, this is Hatfield from the air. On the top left, you can see the old palace of Hatfield, or the surviving little bit of it, which is, I think, the Great Hall. And so Hatfield Palace was an old place that Henry VIII had used as a royal nursery. He'd put his children there. And so Elizabeth I had grown up in this house, and she'd been kept sort of a prisoner there when her sister Mary became queen. And her sister Mary was a Catholic and was very suspicious of her half-sister Elizabeth. And so kept her really a prisoner here. And Elizabeth was sitting under an oak tree in the park when the news was brought to her that Mary was dead and she was queen. The first thing she did was send for William Cecil. And so all those years later, when William's son Robert gets hold of this property, obviously he was thrilled to be there, and with all the associations with the great Queen Elizabeth, it was an especially exciting opportunity. So he immediately tore down most of the old palace, which was ramshackle and rather useless by that stage, and used the bricks to build this vast new house. And he had an architect called Robert Liming, who also built, what did he build? Blickling in Norfolk, which we'll look at another time. And so Liming sort of drew up elevations, and supposedly he only drew up the south and the north elevations. We're looking at the south one here facing London, and not the east and west, which is why it looks a bit odd from east and west. I'm not sure if that's really true, who knows. Anyway, you can see it's a pretty big place. Here it is, that's the south elevation again, a view taken in the 18th century, and you can see a coach arriving. And so obviously this probably was the main entrance to the house originally from London, and I suppose if you were heading off north, you might leave from the other side. But now this side is the family entrance, and if you go to see it with the public, which of course I did, you arrive from the north instead. Here is that south entrance, and so originally there was an open loggia along the front, and that's been filled in with sort of pierced stone grills, as you can see here. And that there's a tower of the orders in the centre there, the three classical orders of architecture stacked on top of each other, and then the clock tower above. And all of that may have been sort of designed by Inigo Jones, or helped by Inigo Jones, who was, a sort of a protege of Robert Cecil. This is the facade of one of the wings. As you can see, they're sort of big enough to be houses on their own, really. And it's got this wonderful thing of the sort of towers in the corners. And here the view from the courtyard of the internal sort of elevation of the other wing. And there you can see there's a sort of a stair tower there. So there's a door at the bottom on the left, and that goes up onto the roof. And here is that doorway. These are all photographs from the 1920s, which I rather love, and obviously I haven't been up on the roof, so that's the only way I can get a view of this wonderful clock tower in the centre of the roof with an arch so that you can walk, you can promenade the full length of the roof, take the air and, see the wonderful views. And it was very splendidly sited up on a sort of a hill, so it did have fantastic views. Then this is the north front, and so this is the side that you arrive at today if you buy a ticket to go in and have a look. And here we are. When you go in, you're in the sort of screens passage. So this house was built at the time when they were still building a great hall with a screen at the end of it, and then behind the screens passage, where, servants would deal with food and things like that. And in the screens passage, there's a couple of sort of Georgian hall chairs, you see, with Lord Salisbury's crest painted on the back. And hall chairs, of course, were never upholstered, because you didn't want, people coming in from outside, possibly with dirt on their clothes, to muck up the fabric on your furniture. And here is the Great Hall, which is known as the Marble Hall because of the black and white checked marble floor. And that floor was put in the 1830s. And what the original floor was, who knows? But it could have been this, because they did have black and white marble floors in other rooms at the time. Here is some of the paneling on that screen. You can see the light coming through the piercings of the screen above, and just incredible, wonderful carving. I love all these details. These, of course, are my own rather amateur photographs taken with a phone. But look at that grotesque face biting onto a sort of, a laurel garland or something, and all the strap work. And I mean, I love all this detail. And then this is the sort of undercroft of the Minstrel's Gallery. And the painting there is done in 1878 by a Sienese painter called Giulio Taldini, I think, who there doesn't seem to be any record of at all, really, except that he was brought in by, I think, the second Marquis of Salisbury in the 1870s to do this work. And he seems to have also restored some of the paintings in the Duomo in Orvieto. So, but you can see it's very much in Renaissance revival style, and it probably gives an idea of what might have been there originally, vaguely. And what definitely were there originally were these tables and benches, and the Great Hall was the place where the entire household would eat, and so hundreds of people would sit there and eat, and so they needed these enormously long benches that people would sit on. And they are extraordinary things. And look at the way the wood has warped over those 400 years. But they are incredible. And they were, of course, removed in the 19th century. They weren't there then, but they must have found them in the attic somewhere and put them back in. Now when you go to look, there they are. Then here's some more of that paneling. This is above the fireplace, I think, and a wonderful sort of 1780s ormolu clock underneath this rather fantastic picture of a white horse that supposedly was the horse ridden by Queen Elizabeth when she made her famous speech at Tilbury. I'm sure that's completely untrue, but that's from Lord David Cecil's guidebook to the house, published in 1970. Anyway, in the room now is the famous rainbow portrait of Queen Elizabeth. And here you see she's holding a rainbow and wearing this fantastic outfit. And on the portrait it says something about, there's no rainbow without the sun. And obviously she is the sun. And then on her cloak are eyes and ears. And so they used to say that this was because it symbolized that she heard and saw everything. Probably, in fact, what it may have been painted, commissioned by Robert Cecil, possibly after the Queen's death, from the same John de Critz, who painted his standard face pattern and most of his portraits, and had this posthumous portrait of the Queen painted in order to allude to the fact that he'd been her first minister and that he'd sort of run her spy network. I mean, is that, might be, mightn't it? He was a bit of a protege of Francis Walsingham, who was her minister, who was the sort of spy master. And so he took over that job after Walsingham died, I suppose. And then on her sleeve, she's got this jewelled serpent, which I think also symbolizes wisdom. Anyway, we go from there to the staircase. And the staircase is really one of the marvels of the house. It's in this incredible sort of orgy of wood carving and imagery. And it's rather copying the one from Theobalds. And this is the remaining fragment of the staircase at Theobalds. And I don't think there's anything left of that enormous house of Cecil's father, except for these bits of the staircase which were moved to, I think, 3 other houses, and then finally ended up in a house called Hurstmonceux Castle, where they still are. But you can see it's very, very similar. Here's the Hatfield staircase I think this is in the 70s, and everything's been painted white, and the wood is just natural. And then here it is now, photographed by me, and they've taken the white paint off the ceiling, revealing the wonderful Victorian paintwork from, I think that's from 1830, or is it from 1870? But it's sort of in the spirit of, the time of the building of the house. And maybe there was painting like that. I think at least part of it was painted. There was a man called Roland Bucket, and that's a good name, isn't it? Roland Bucket was paid quite a lot of money for the painting in many colours and gilding of the staircase and at least part of the ceiling. But it does look fantastic. There is that ceiling paintwork now. It's partly gilded and then partly stenciled, and I think it's absolutely wonderful. And here there's a dog gate, and there aren't many dog gates from 1611 or whenever that was made surviving, but there's one, and obviously you close it to stop the dogs from going upstairs and getting into the bedrooms. And on the newel post there is a baby playing bagpipes, and honestly, what could any great statesman wish for more than having, a symbol saying hello and welcome to my house that's a baby playing bagpipes. And here more of those carvings, and aren't they just fantastic? And they must have come from emblem books or architectural books, and I'm sure somebody much more learned than me would be able to tell you exactly which contemporary book of prints all of these designs came from. But I think they're absolutely wonderful. All these different things, every single one is different. And presumably originally they were all painted in vivid colours, but they do look rather fantastic just in wood. And then quite a lot of them have heraldic beasts on top, you see, holding shields with the coats of arms of the various, families and relations. And then look at this, isn't it? It's so playful and lovely. Love these things. And then here's a child with a book, and here's another one playing a lute and holding up some tapestry behind. And I love the way that the house has been redecorated quite recently, don't know when, but quite recently, putting all these tapestries on the walls and painting the walls this wonderful red colour. And look, here's a baby riding a horse jumping over a cauldron of fire. What's that about? And I'm sure every single one of these had a emblematic meaning at the time that everybody visiting would have been, oh yes, of course, that shows, just how brave he is or something. And then this is a famous one of this sort of dancing gardener. And there's an idea that this might be a portrait of John Tredescant, who was the sort of gardener and plant hunter to Lord Salisbury, mainly in London, but also here at Hatfield. But it's a lovely image, and that's an actual portrait of Tredescant I think in the Ashmolean in Oxford, which is founded really on his collection. He opened the first public museum in England during his lifetime in sort of 1610 or something, and then I think his collection was bought by Elias Ashmole and then turned into the University of Oxford's museum, the Ashmolean Museum, later on in the 17th century. But that's a lovely picture of him, all surrounded by plants that he imported. So he'd go on plant hunting expeditions paid for by Robert Cecil. Anyway, here we are back at the top of the staircase, and another heraldic beast with a coat of arms and the tapestries beyond. And now we're going into what's known as the King James drawing room. And it's the King James drawing room, I suppose, because it's got an enormous figure of King James over the fireplace. Here it is in those photographs from, I think, the 1920s. And then here in 1970 in that old guidebook. And now, this is what it looks like now. And you've got to say, it looks a bit better. Doesn't it look marvellous? And so they've covered the walls with tapestries and then covered the tapestries with this incredible collection of paintings and covered the furniture and this wonderful, look at that green figured velvet and that scarlet sort of damask on those two armchairs. I think it's the most sort of luxurious and comfortable looking grand room in England. It's wonderful. Anyway, here we are. Detail of the ermine portrait of Queen Elizabeth, another famous portrait with an ermine on her sleeve, which is a symbol of virginity, I think, something like that. There is the full portrait. What a dress. And yeah, I'm afraid I don't know who that is, but just another wonderful painting hung on this wonderful background of all of these tapestries. And I love this guy. And he's holding a sign that says something like, you know, once you're born, you start dying. It's a wonderfully mad image. And then in the room, there's a couple of tables, one of them Victorian and the other one made probably for the house. Maybe not for the house. Maybe it was, you know, of course they had several houses. And there was an enormous London house, Salisbury House on the Strand, with gardens going down to the Thames and a water gate on the Thames. And maybe this was from there. But I think this is the old one. And of course, every time I go there, I get down on my knees, crawling under the table to look at the base of the table, because you can't see it if you're standing. But it's such a beautiful sort of table base, isn't it marvellous? It's a sort of a console bracket with a kind of satyr or something embedded in it and holding on to it. I mean, I think it's just it's so sort of playful and imaginative and mad. And here is King James on the fireplace, and I think he's in bronze, and maybe he's produced. I don't know. I mean, some of the fireplaces were done by a man called Maximilian Colt, who also did Lord Salisbury's tomb, which we'll see at the end. Whether he did this or not, I don't know, but it's rather wonderful. And he was a very dressy king, of course, you know, and he also, of course, liked to dress his male favourites, and they all rather enjoyed a little bit of velvet and embroidery. Anyway, here we are in the long gallery, and this was made longer in 1830 or 1870 or something by opening it up to the two rooms at the ends. So you see there's a couple of columns there, and so they you know, there used to be a wall there basically, and so it became enormously long, and it's got two enormous chimneys in it, two enormous fireplaces, and then the second Marquis, or whoever it was, in I think 1870, went to Venice on holiday, you know, and he went to Venice. And he saw a gilded ceiling. He thought that was rather good, you know, it looked good in Hertfordshire. And so he went back home and he had the ceiling in here gilded. The entire thing is gold. And it sort of sounds like it would be terrible, but it's wonderful. It has such a fantastic effect. And it somehow makes the room rather sort of cozy and nice and makes it glow. It's just fantastic. And these beautiful fireplaces, and then you can see this amazing wood panelling, which has got sort of marquetry designs led into it. It's just fantastic. And then the gilded ceiling. Look at that. It's splendid. But I love the idea of going to Venice and seeing a gilded ceiling in Venice and thinking, oh, we're rather good at Hatfield, I think. And then in there, there's a wonderful chair and stool designed by William Kent, clearly. And I don't know the only thing I could find about it. It said that it was made for Hampton Court, but then I looked at pictures of Hampton Court, and there's a very similar chair, or a set of very similar things, but not, so no idea. But, you know, various Lord Salisbury were sort of Lord Chamberlain and things like that, and so as perks of office, they'd have got to remove bits of furniture from royal palaces, and so presumably the chair, and there's the footstool that goes with it by William Kent, arrived then. So they're from about 1720 And aren't they fantastic? And then halfway down the gallery is it sort of has this little space jutting off it, going to the other side of the house. And so here that there are, I suppose, shutters that can open so that you look down into the great hall. But here they are closed, and how they open, I don't know. And I'm not sure. Maybe they were closed up later on, or maybe there's another space. But I think that wall on the right opens up somehow. And then also in this picture, you can't really see, but on the right there is King Charles I's cradle. That's where baby King Charles I, I mean, he was just Prince Charles, he wasn't even Prince of Wales then, because he had an older brother, but that was his cradle as a baby. And then in the window, that very grand looking chair that you can barely see, that's Queen Anne's coronation chair of estate. And then here's a wonderful picture of Lord Burleigh, William Cecil, the father of the builder of this house, riding his mule at Theobalds, probably. Looking absolutely fantastic. I love that image. It's just so funny, isn't it? And then this is a wonderful set of, rock crystal and enamel gold things that are sitting in a little vitrine in that gallery today. And they, according to Lord David Cecil, they were the wedding present of the Spanish ambassador to Queen Mary and Philip of Spain, which doesn't seem to make any sense whatsoever. But anyway, who knows? Who knows what the story of that is? I mean, obviously Lord Salisbury knows. But they are very, very beautiful. And they're just sort of sitting behind a bit of glass in there. And then in a cabinet is this glove, or I think a pair of gloves, supposedly belonging to Queen Elizabeth. And they're so beautiful, whether they belong to her or not. I mean, they might have done. They very likely they did. But what I love is the length of the fingers of the gloves, And of course I think that the last third of the finger, or maybe half of the finger, has a wooden stay, or a cork maybe stay inside, keeping it straight. But you can imagine when she's wearing it, and they must have looked terribly sort of elegant and beautiful, mustn't they? And then also in there, this is the badge of the ladies' order of, what's it called, the Crown of India, I think. And so this was when Queen Victoria was made Empress of India by Disraeli, who loved the idea of his queen being an empress as well. And so she wanted something to wear, and wanted some badge of this. And so she had this order of the Crown of India, and gave it to all the ladies connected with India. Whether any Indian ladies got it, I don't know. But certainly, I think Lady Salisbury, because the Lord Salisbury of the time was Secretary of State for India or something, and so Lady Salisbury got it, and it's sitting there. And it's rather nice. It says VRI, you see, Victoria Regina Imperatrix in turquoise is there. And then also in turquoise is this eagle brooch, which is one of the ones that was made to a design by Prince Albert, I think, and given to Queen Victoria's bridesmaids after their wedding. And one of the bridesmaids was a Lady Frances Jocelyn, who then, I think, was the grandmother of one of the Lord Salisbury, and so that's sitting there as well. Anyway, then this is a new dining room created because I suppose the old one was just the Great Hall, which must have been terribly draughty and difficult to eat in, very cold and rather public. So they made this dining room in 1870 or something out of two rooms, and brought in this wonderful fireplace, which I think again is by Maximilian Colt, but is from another of their houses that I suppose they'd sold or knocked down or something. Isn't that fireplace fantastic? And this is a little room sort of next to there, between there and a staircase or something, and I rather love that incredibly. efficient-looking fire extinguishing equipment there. And I like also that pierced vent over the door and the very architectural door frame. It's absolutely beautiful. And then in there, in that little space, is this fantastic thing, which is a pedigree of Elizabeth I that must have been probably designed by Lord Burleigh or Lord Salisbury, one of them, sort of to flatter the Queen, and it's always been in the the schedules of the contents of Hatfield since Hatfield was built. So maybe it was originally made by Lord Burleigh and he had it in London, or maybe it was at Theobalds, and was drawn up by Lord Burleigh in order to just flatter the Queen and just show all the visitors how extraordinarily well connected and grand Queen Elizabeth was, because of course, she was known to all the Catholic rulers of Europe. Thought of her as the bastard child of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn's bastard child, and they were all very rude about her, and so it was very important, to Lord Burleigh to big her up and make her seem like, the grandest prince in Christendom, and so he had this pedigree drawn up. It starts with Adam and Eve, which is a good place to start. I mean, you might as well be, descended from the first people, to exist on the planet. And then it goes down through Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. And, I mean, absolutely anyone who was anyone in history was an ancestor of Elizabeth I, according to this fantastic document. Who this is, I can't remember. But, and it's King Arthur and Brutus and, everybody. But it's a wonderful thing. And the fact that it's just sitting there is so good. Anyway, here is the library. And this, whether it was originally a library, I'm not sure. But it has this other fantastic fireplace. Isn't it wonderful? And it's been redecorated now. Every piece of furniture covered in this wonderfully sort of comfortable looking shiny red leather. And I mean, I can't think of a more inviting, exciting room. Look at that, isn't it splendid? And the fireplace has inset into it this fantastic Venetian mosaic portrait of Lord Salisbury, done by his sort of friend and colleague, can't remember his name, Wotton or someone, who was the ambassador of England to Venice, and had this done in sort of 1610 or something in Venice, and sent it back. And Lord Salisbury, whether that one or his son, who succeeded him, because of course poor Lord Salisbury, as I said at the beginning, only got to sleep 8 nights in the house and it wasn't even finished. But anyway, that portrait sitting there, and it's fantastic. And when you go, of course, you get, because part of the mosaic is gilded, and so it reflects in the most wonderful way. And of course, it's just a copy of that John de Crit's, say exactly the same portrait, just done up in garter robes. And here's more of that wonderful red leather covered furniture, and a very good reading chair there, you see. And you put your book on that fold-up stand thing, and then you sit and you can put your arms on the arms on the back. Frightfully comfortable. And there's some big books in a wire bookcase. And now here there's some rooms that are not open to the public, and so of course I couldn't take any photographs or see them. But I found these pictures in an old book. And so here's another wonderful fireplace. Look at that. Oh, and then this picture, the same fireplace, a rather good book on Elizabethan architecture. Isn't that beautiful, that fireplace? Look at those figures. And I think they're the 4 seasons, and around the centre are the 4 elements, something like that. It's all very, very symbolic. And then here a fantastic, very grand bed from about, I suppose, when's that? About 1700 or something, 1690. Beautiful thing. Look at that painted ceiling. And I love the way it's just every historical era just shoved in together, layered together. And look at that wonderful fireplace. That must be the same period as that bed, I suppose. 1680 maybe. It's wonderful, isn't it? Love that. Against the much earlier wooden panelling. And then this is the one bedroom that you see on the tour. There's an open door and you can peer through into this recently redecorated room with lovely Chinese wallpaper. And then what I imagine that bizarre sort of cupboard-looking thing is the bathroom of the bedroom next door. I've no idea, but I imagine that the bedroom next door needed a bathroom, and so they built this little box in this bedroom, knocked a door through, and then dressed the box up to look like a strange Chinese sort of thing in the corner of the room. And it's just such a brilliant sort of decorating idea. And who did this? I don't know. And they don't say, of course. They just, there's the door open and a rope, and you sort of peer over the rope and you see this vision of loveliness. And why they couldn't put a little sign saying this clever idea was done by so and so. But anyway, somebody better connected than me would know exactly who did that. But I think they're a genius. It's frightfully clever. And this is the rest of that room. There's wonderful turquoise wallpaper. I love that sort of cinnabar red paint on the fireplace, and again on the ceiling as well. It's a beautifully decorated room. I don't know who's been redecorating that house, but it's marvellous. And then this is what was the loggia, the open loggia originally, and then was closed up with those grills, do you remember, at the beginning, and then turned into an armoury at some point. And so it's hung with all of this armour, and there's a saddle in the foreground, and then a wonderful portrait of some Edwardian Lady Salisbury and her child. And so that's that loggia from outside, you see along the bottom there, and so all the arches of the loggia filled now with these pierced screens and glass. They look rather fantastic. What that bath's doing there, I don't know. And at the end of that sort of loggia, gallery, armoury, is this incredible organ. And this organ is the only surviving bit of decoration in the house by the famous Roland Bucket, who's the man who painted the staircase, and probably painted a whole lot of the house. And this organ was made. Which room it was made for, I'm not sure. I think maybe it was made for the chapel, or it was in the chapel in the 18th century. But whether it was, I don't think it was it wasn't a religious thing to have an organ. It was just you had an organ as the biggest and grandest sort of musical instrument you could have. But it is very beautiful. Here it was in the morning room or the summer drawing room or something in the 1920s before it was moved into that place. But look at the decoration of it, isn't it marvellous? Really, really wonderful. And that supposedly is the original decor. I suppose probably renewed and refreshed and restored in 1870 or something. But a remarkable survival. And that organ was made by somebody else, but it was then I think repaired and stored by this extraordinary man who made an enormous mechanical organ for the Sultan of Turkey, and sent it, went with it to Istanbul and had enormous adventures, which is another fantastic story we should look at. Anyway, that's all I've got of the house. But here is Maximilian Kolb's tomb of Lord Salisbury. And isn't it just marvellous? And so it's a sort of a table tomb. So he's lying on top in his garter robes, and he's holding his staff of office and his actual staff of office as Lord Treasurer. And then he's supported by the 4 cardinal virtues, I think, one at each corner. And then underneath, he's laid out as a skeleton. And there at his feet is his crest, which is, arrows held by a sort of a girdle. I mean, I think it's just a girdle. It's not the Order of the Garter, and then crowned by a Modian helmet, but all carved in alabaster, I suppose. And there on the left, that's the virtue of fortitude. I know that because she's got a broken column. But it is the most wonderful thing. And look at him. Doesn't he look splendid? It's absolutely marvellous. And look at that wonderful sort of embroidered cushion pillow he's got. And there's his staff of office and his garter chain. And then, you know, a little bit later on, I suppose, lying as a skeleton on a woven rush mat. Absolutely beautiful thing. Love that. And then in the same chapel, that's him in the background, and then the foreground here is his descendant, the third Marquis of Salisbury, who was Prime Minister, you know, under Queen Victoria for about 20 years or something. And so, you know, the first one, Prime Minister in, 1603 or something, and this one more or less died in office. I think he died in 1903, and in 1902 he'd had to resign because he could no longer really keep it together, and he resigned in favour of his nephew, Arthur Balfour, who was his sister's son. He was, you know, Arthur Balfour, and the father, of course, was Robert. He was Robert Gascoigne Cecil, because his father had needed a bit of cash and had married a Miss Gascoigne, who was very rich. And so he was Robert Gascoigne Cecil, but he was Robert Lord Salisbury, like his ancestor. And and of course Robert Lord Salisbury, and then when he gave his nephew, the job of being, I can't remember what, some political job, and so people said, of course, oh well, Bob's your uncle. Anyway, here he is. So that's Lord Salisbury. And here he is in death, as it were, and his effigy on top of his tomb. And it's rather marvellous with his ancestor in white marble, and here he is in dark bronze. But again, with the garter. And there's his George of the Garter underneath, his clasped hands on his chest. And he was a deeply religious man. And he was actually Clement Attlee, who was the Socialist Labour Prime Minister after the Second World War, was asked who was the greatest politician of his lifetime. He said, well, Lord Salisbury. So he obviously was quite a thing. But it's a fantastic tomb. But it is a very extraordinary idea, isn't it, that this country had, Lord Salisbury running it in 1603 and Lord Salisbury running it in 1902. Anyway, there we are. Bye.